The first time anyone noticed them, it was already too late to pretend it was nothing. The grave had been there for years, quiet, undisturbed, sitting on the far edge of the old cemetery where the land sloped gently toward a line of twisted trees. Most people avoided that part of the grounds. Not out of fear exactly, but because it felt heavier there. The kind of place where silence lingered longer than it should. The grave itself was simple, marked only by a worn stone with no name carved into it. Just a faint symbol that time had nearly erased. No one in the village remembered exactly who had been buried there. Some said it was a traveler. Others claimed it was something older, something that had come and gone before anyone thought to ask questions. But whatever the truth had been, it had been forgotten. Until the dragons came. They were small. Far too small to be what anyone expected when they heard the word dragon. Barely larger than cats. Their bodies soft with youth. Their scales not yet hardened into the sharp, gleaming armor of their kind. And yet, even in their smallness, there was no mistaking what they were. 3 of them, always together, always in the same place. Every night, just after the sun dipped below the horizon, they would appear at the edge of the cemetery, moving quietly through the grass until they reached that same forgotten grave. They never wandered, never explored, never caused trouble. They simply sat there, waiting. At first, the villagers thought it was coincidence, passing curiosity. But when the pattern continued night after night without fail, it became something else. Something harder to ignore. They're back again. One of the villagers muttered softly one evening, standing at a distance as the 3 small shapes settled into their usual place beside the grave. The others who had gathered nearby didn't respond immediately. They were watching, the same quiet tension in their expressions, the same uncertainty in the way they kept their distance. The smallest of the 3 dragons curled close to the base of the stone, its body pressed against the earth as if trying to stay as close to it as possible. One of the others sat just behind it, its head lifted slightly, its gaze fixed on the path that led out of the cemetery, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. The third paced, not restlessly, not nervously, but with a slow, steady rhythm, moving a few steps away from the grave before returning again, over and over, like it was checking something. Waiting for something. "What are they doing?" someone whispered. The question hung in the air, unanswered, because no one knew. They didn't behave like wild creatures. They didn't search for food, didn't react to the presence of the villagers watching them. They didn't even acknowledge anyone who came close, so long as the distance was maintained. Their attention was fixed entirely on that one place, that one grave. And the longer the villagers watched, the more unsettling the realization became. They weren't just staying there. They were waiting. The old man, who had seen more seasons than most and spoke less than anyone, stepped forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied the scene. "They're expecting someone," he said quietly. The others turned toward him. "Expecting?" one woman asked. He nodded once. "That's not random behavior," he continued. "That's routine." He gestured faintly toward the dragons. "They come at the same time. They stay until the same hour. And they don't leave until it's clear nothing is coming." The group fell silent again, the weight of his words settling in. Because once that thought took hold, it was impossible to ignore. Every movement the dragons made fit that pattern. The way one watched the path. The way another stayed close to the grave. The way the third moved back and forth as if checking, as if hoping. "But who are they waiting for?" someone asked softly. The old man didn't answer right away. His gaze shifted from the dragons to the grave. The worn stone, the faded symbol, the place no one remembered anymore. "That's the question, isn't it?" he murmured. The dragons remained there as the light faded completely, their small forms barely visible in the growing darkness. The villagers eventually left, one by one, their curiosity unresolved, their unease lingering. But the dragons didn't leave. Not yet. They stayed, just as they always did. And when the night grew deep enough, when it became clear that no one was coming, that the path would remain empty, the smallest dragon let out a soft sound. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. but it carried something that made anyone who heard it pause. A quiet, aching note that felt wrong in its softness. The others responded immediately. The one watching the path lowered its head. The one pacing stopped completely. They gathered closer to the grave, their bodies pressing in, forming a small, silent circle around the stone. And then, only then, they left. Not quickly, not suddenly, but slowly, reluctantly, as if every step away was something they didn't want to take. The pattern repeated the next night, and the next, and the next, always the same, always waiting, always leaving only when it was clear that whoever they expected wasn't coming. By the end of the week, the village could no longer ignore it. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It wasn't even unease. It was something heavier, something that settled deep and refused to move. "They don't understand," one of the women said quietly one evening as they watched from a distance again. "They think someone is going to come back." No one argued with her, because that was exactly what it looked like. And that was exactly what made it so difficult to watch. The grave was empty. Whoever had been buried there was gone. Whatever story had once existed had ended long ago. But the dragons didn't know that. Or maybe they did, and they simply refused to accept it. The old man exhaled slowly, his eyes never leaving the small figures by the stone. "Or maybe," he said quietly, "they're not waiting because they don't know." The others glanced at him. "Then why?" someone asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because they remember." The words settled into the silence, heavy and unshakable. And suddenly, the scene before them felt different. Not strange, not unsettling, but something else entirely. Something that didn't need explanation to be understood. The three tiny dragons weren't lost. They weren't confused. They weren't waiting by accident. They were waiting because someone had once been there, and they weren't ready to let that go. By the second week, the waiting had become something the village could no longer treat as distant or strange. It had settled into their routines, quietly reshaping the way people thought about the far edge of the cemetery. No one laughed about it anymore. No one dismissed it as coincidence or instinct. The three tiny dragons had made something painfully clear. Whatever bound them to that empty grave was not simple, and it was not fading. If anything, it was growing heavier with each passing night. People began to visit more often. Not in large groups, not openly, but in ones and twos, standing at a respectful distance, watching the same quiet ritual unfold again and again. The dragons would arrive just as the last light disappeared, moving with that same steady purpose, that same quiet certainty. The smallest would press itself close to the base of the stone, curling there as if it belonged to the earth itself. The second would take its place behind, watching the path with unwavering focus, its body still, its attention sharp. And the third would pace slow, measured steps, never straying too far, never stopping completely. It became impossible not to notice the pattern beneath the pattern, the subtle shifts that spoke of something deeper than routine. They weren't just waiting, they were hoping. And that hope, fragile as it was, did not weaken with time the way the villagers had expected. It endured. That was what unsettled people most. One evening, as a thin wind moved through the cemetery and the sky dimmed into soft gray, a young woman stepped closer than anyone had before. Not recklessly, not without hesitation, but with a quiet determination that made the others pause where they stood. "You shouldn't go too near," someone whispered behind her. She didn't turn back. "I'm not going to scare them," she replied softly. Her eyes remained fixed on the small figures by the grave. "I just want to see." She moved slowly, her steps careful against the uneven ground, stopping well short of the grave but close enough now that the details became clearer. The dragons noticed her immediately. The one that had been watching the path shifted its gaze toward her, its body tensing slightly, while the pacing one stopped mid-step, its attention snapping fully in her direction. The smallest, curled against the stone, did not move at first, but after a moment, it lifted its head just enough to look. For a few seconds, everything held still. The air felt tight, balanced on something uncertain. Then, surprisingly, the dragons did not retreat. They did not growl or lash out. They simply watched her. The woman exhaled slowly, keeping her posture open, her movements minimal. "It's okay," she said quietly, her voice low, steady. "I'm not here to take anything." The words didn't matter. Not in the way human language usually did. But the tone, the calm, the absence of threat, carried through. The pacing dragon took one cautious step back, but it did not flee. The one watching the path shifted its weight slightly, still alert, but no longer braced for immediate action. The smallest dragon held her gaze for a moment longer, then slowly lowered its head again, returning to its place against the grave. That was the moment something changed. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone could name outright, but it shifted the understanding of everyone watching. These creatures were not acting out of confusion. They were not reacting blindly to loss. They were aware. They understood enough to distinguish between threat and presence, between danger and stillness. And yet they stayed. Night after night, they repeated the same quiet ritual, holding on to something that no longer existed in the way they expected. The woman stood there for a long time, saying nothing more, simply observing. And the longer she watched, the more something inside her tightened. "They're not just waiting," she said finally, her voice softer than before. "They're remembering." The old man, standing behind her, nodded faintly. "Yes," he said, "that's what I've been thinking." She glanced back at him briefly, then returned her attention to the grave. "Then someone needs to tell them," she said. The words landed heavier than she intended. The others shifted uneasily. "Tell them what?" someone asked quietly. She hesitated. "That whoever they're waiting for isn't coming back." The silence that followed was immediate and thick, because it sounded reasonable. It sounded logical. But as soon as it was spoken aloud, something about it felt wrong. The old man shook his head slowly. "And how would you do that?" he asked. She didn't answer right away, because she didn't know. There was no language to bridge that gap. No simple way to explain absence to creatures who had built their entire routine around refusing to accept it. "Maybe they already know," the old man added quietly. The woman frowned slightly. "Then why keep coming back?" she asked. He looked at the dragons again, the way they held their positions, the way their small forms pressed close to the grave, the way the one watching the path still lifted its head every few seconds as if expecting movement in the distance. "Because knowing something," he said slowly, "and accepting it are not the same thing." That truth settled into the space between them, heavy and undeniable. The woman's shoulders lowered slightly, her earlier resolve softening into something more uncertain. She turned her gaze back to the dragons, watching them with a different understanding now. Not as creatures who needed to be corrected, but as ones who were holding on to something they weren't ready to lose. The night deepened, and as always, the moment came when the waiting began to falter. The path remained empty. The air remained still. No footsteps approached. No figure peered. The smallest dragon let out that same soft, aching sound as before. A quiet note that seemed to carry everything it couldn't express any other way. The others responded, drawing closer, their bodies pressing together near the grave. The woman felt her chest tighten unexpectedly. "They're going to leave again," she whispered. The old man nodded. "Yes," he said, "until tomorrow." And that was the part that hurt the most. Not the waiting, not even the quiet realization that no one was coming, but the fact that they would return again the next night, and the next, and the next, not because they were foolish, not because they didn't understand, but because they couldn't stop hoping. And as the three tiny dragons finally turned away from the empty grave, moving slowly back into the darkness beyond the cemetery, the villagers remained where they were, watching them go, not with confusion anymore, not with unease, but with something far more difficult to carry. Understanding. The realization didn't fade with time, it settled deeper. By the third week, the presence of the three tiny dragons at the grave had become something the entire village felt, even those who never went to see it for themselves. It lingered in conversations that trailed off too early, in the quiet pauses between tasks, in the way people glanced toward the distant edge of the cemetery as evening approached. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something heavier. Something that asked a question no one seemed able to answer. What do you do when someone refuses to let go? Not because they don't understand, but because they remember too well? The young woman returned again that evening, earlier than before, arriving just as the sky began to dim. She wasn't alone this time. The old man walked beside her, slower but steady, his gaze already fixed on the worn stone in the distance. Neither of them spoke much as they approached. There wasn't much left to say, not in words, anyway. They stopped at the same respectful distance as before, the ground between them and the grave untouched, a quiet boundary both sides had come to recognize. The dragons arrived shortly after. As always, the pattern held. The smallest curled against the base of the stone. The second settled just behind, watching the path. The third began its slow pacing, steps measured, deliberate, like a habit too deeply ingrained to question anymore. But tonight, something felt different. Subtle. Hard to name. The woman noticed it first. "They're quieter," she murmured. The old man didn't respond immediately, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he studied them. She was right. The movements were the same, but the energy beneath them had shifted. Less urgency. Less restless tension. Not because the waiting had ended, but because something about it had worn down. Not hope. That was still there, stubborn as ever. But the sharp edge of expectation had softened into something more fragile. Something closer to quiet endurance. The woman felt her chest tighten. "They're getting tired," she said softly. The old man nodded once. "Even hope can weigh something down," he replied. They stood in silence for a while, watching as the dragons settled into their roles, the ritual unfolding once again beneath the fading light. And then the woman stepped forward. Not suddenly. Not without hesitation, but with a kind of quiet resolve that hadn't been there before. The old man glanced at her, but didn't stop her this time. He understood. She moved slowly, her steps careful, stopping closer than she ever had before. Close enough now that she could see the faint texture of the stone, the worn edges where time had softened its shape. The dragons noticed immediately. The one watching the path shifted its gaze toward her, its body tensing slightly. The pacing one stopped, turning fully in her direction. The smallest lifted its head again, its eyes finding her without hesitation. But this time, they didn't react with the same sharp alertness. They watched her, but there was no warning sound, no movement to drive her away, just attention. The woman swallowed lightly, lowering herself slowly to her knees, not at the grave, but a short distance from it, keeping that invisible boundary intact. Her hands rested loosely in her lap, her posture calm, open. "I don't know how to say this in a way you'll understand," she began softly. The words felt strange, almost pointless, but she continued anyway. "And maybe you don't need to understand it the way we do." The dragons remained still, their attention fixed on her. The woman's gaze shifted to the grave. "But I think you already know," she said quietly. The wind moved faintly through the trees, carrying the sound of her voice across the small space. "I think you know no one is coming back." The smallest dragon's head tilted slightly, not in confusion but in recognition. The woman's breath caught softly. "And you still come anyway," she added. Her voice didn't break, but it softened, the weight of what she was saying settling into it fully now. "You still wait." The pacing dragon took a slow step forward, then stopped again, its attention locked onto her. The one behind shifted slightly, its posture no longer tense, just present. The woman let out a quiet breath, her eyes remaining on the grave. "That matters," she said. "It matters more than you probably understand." She hesitated for a moment, then reached slowly into the small bag she had brought with her. The movement was careful, deliberate, giving the dragons time to react if they chose to. They didn't. They simply watched. She pulled out a small object, something simple. A carved piece of wood, worn smooth by careful hands. It wasn't large. It wasn't valuable. But it had been made with intention, with care. She placed it gently on the ground, not at the grave, not intruding, but close enough to be seen. "We remember too," she said softly. The words hung in the air, fragile but steady. For a long moment, nothing happened. The dragons didn't move. The woman didn't reach for them. The old man stood quietly behind her, his expression unreadable but his presence unwavering. And then the smallest dragon shifted. Slowly, cautiously, it rose from its place at the base of the stone and stepped forward. One step, then another. It approached the object on the ground, its movements careful, its eyes flicking briefly toward the woman before returning to the small carved piece. It lowered its head, sniffing lightly. The woman held her breath. The dragon paused. Then very gently it nudged the object once. Not rejecting it, not taking it, just acknowledging it. The other two dragons moved closer as well, their attention drawn to the same place. They didn't interfere. They didn't pull the smallest back. They simply stood beside it, watching. And in that moment, something shifted again. Not in a dramatic, obvious way, but in something quieter, deeper. The space between them, the humans and the dragons, changed. It was no longer just observation, no longer just distance and shared silence. It was connection, fragile, uncertain, but real. The smallest dragon turned its head slightly, its eyes meeting the woman's again. And this time, there was something there that hadn't been before. Not confusion, not simple awareness, but understanding, not of words, not of explanations, but of something simpler, something that didn't need language. The woman felt it, her chest tightening again. But this time, not with helplessness, with something else, something steadier. "You don't have to stop coming," she said softly. "You don't have to forget." The dragon held her gaze for a moment longer. Then, slowly, it turned back toward the grave and returned to its place at the base of the stone. The others followed, settling once more into their familiar positions. The ritual continued. The waiting remained. But it felt different now. Not as sharp, not as isolated. Because for the first time, they weren't the only ones who understood what it meant to stay. And as the night deepened and the path remained empty once again, the dragons did not leave immediately. They stayed a little longer this time. Just a little. As if something had shifted in the space around them. As if the silence didn't feel quite as heavy as it had before. And when they finally did turn away from the grave, moving slowly back into the darkness, it wasn't with the same quiet ache of before. It was softer, not because the loss was gone, but because it was no longer carried alone. The change didn't come all at once. It never did. But from that night forward, something in the cemetery felt different, as if the silence itself had softened. The grave was still empty, the path still led nowhere, and the three tiny dragons still returned every evening, just as they always had. But the weight of their waiting was no longer as sharp, no longer as isolating. It had been seen now, understood, and in a quiet, unspoken way, it had been shared. The villagers began to come more often, not in groups, not in ways that would overwhelm the fragile balance, but steadily, one or two at a time. Some stood at a distance, simply watching. Others brought small things with them. Simple objects, carved wood, woven cloth, a single flower placed gently on the ground near the grave. None of it was intrusive. None of it replaced what had been lost. But it added something new to the space. Presence. Memory. The young woman returned each evening without fail, always taking the same place a short distance from the grave, always sitting quietly, never forcing interaction. The old man came less frequently, but when he did, he stood with the same calm stillness, his gaze steady, his understanding deeper than most. And the dragons noticed. They didn't react in obvious ways at first. They still held their positions, the smallest curled against the base of the stone, the second watching the path, the third pacing in that slow, measured rhythm. But there were small changes, subtle ones that only became clear if you watched long enough. The pacing grew less constant. The pauses became longer. The one watching the path didn't lift its head quite as often, as if the expectation had shifted. Not disappeared, but softened into something less urgent. And the smallest no longer pressed itself as tightly against the stone. still stayed close, but there was space now. Just a little. Enough to breathe. One evening, as the sky turned a deep shade of violet and the first stars began to appear, something happened that no one had expected. The smallest dragon did not go immediately to the base of the grave. It approached as always, but then it stopped a short distance away, its head tilting slightly as it looked at the stone. The other two paused as well, their movements slowing, their attention shifting toward it. The villagers watching from a distance held their breath without realizing it. The moment stretched, quiet, fragile, uncertain. Then, slowly, the smallest dragon stepped forward, but not all the way to the stone. Instead, it turned slightly, its gaze drifting toward the edge of the cemetery where the young woman sat. She didn't move, didn't speak. She simply met its gaze, her posture calm, her presence steady. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the dragon made a soft sound, quieter than anything it had made before, not filled with ache, not heavy with longing. Just soft. The other two responded, stepping closer to it instead of moving directly to the grave. The smallest dragon turned back once more, glancing at the stone, just briefly, before settling down beside the others, not pressed against the grave this time, but near it. Close enough to remain connected. Far enough to be something new. The shift was small, almost unnoticeable, but it carried meaning far greater than its size. The woman felt it immediately, her chest tightening as she realized what she was seeing. "They're not waiting the same way anymore," she whispered. The old man, standing a short distance behind her, nodded faintly. "No," he said quietly. "They're remembering differently." The ritual did not disappear. The dragons still came each night. They still stayed until the darkness deepened and the world grew still. But the way they stayed had changed. The constant watch on the path faded, replaced by quieter moments of stillness. The pacing became less frequent, more occasional, as if it was no longer driven by restless expectation but by something closer to habit. And the smallest no longer clung to the grave as if it were the only thing anchoring it to the world. It stayed nearby, but it also looked outward now. Toward the trees, toward the open space, toward the quiet figures who had begun to share that space with it. Days turned into weeks, and the change continued. Not in dramatic leaps, but in small, steady steps. The villagers became part of the rhythm, not as intruders, not as replacements for what had been lost, but as something that existed alongside it. Children were brought to the edge of the cemetery, taught to stay quiet, to respect the space, to understand what it meant to remember something that was no longer there. Flowers appeared more often. Small tokens were left with care. The grave, once forgotten, became something that held meaning again, not because its past had been rediscovered, but because its present had been shaped by something real. And through it all, the dragons remained. Not trapped, not bound, but choosing to stay. One night, as the air cooled and the stars filled the sky, the smallest dragon did something no one had seen before. It stood slowly, stretching its small body as it looked once more at the grave. It didn't approach it. It didn't press close. It simply looked quietly, steadily, for a long moment. Then it turned away, not fully, not leaving, but stepping just a little farther from the stone than it ever had before. The other two watched it, then followed, not abandoning the place but shifting with it, adjusting to the change without resistance. The woman noticed immediately, her breath catching softly. She didn't move, didn't interrupt. She simply watched as the three small figures settled together slightly farther from the grave than they had ever been. Still close, still connected, but no longer held in place by the same quiet weight. "They're letting go," she whispered. The old man shook his head gently. "No," he said, "not letting go." He paused, his gaze steady, his voice soft but certain. "They're learning how to carry it." The difference was small, but it was everything, because letting go meant leaving something behind. And that was not what the dragons were doing. They were not forgetting. They were not abandoning the place where something important had once been. They were changing how they held it, how they lived with it, how they moved forward without losing what had mattered. And as the night deepened and the dragons eventually turned away from the grave, leaving the cemetery as they always did. The villagers did not feel the same quiet ache they once had when watching them go. There was still sadness. That would always be there. But it was no longer sharp, no longer heavy in the same way, because something had shifted, not just for the dragons, but for everyone who had watched them. The grave remained, the past remained, but the waiting had changed, and in that change something new had taken its place. Not an ending, not even a resolution, but something quieter, something steadier, something that didn't need to be explained to be understood. The 3 tiny dragons still returned each night, but they no longer waited for someone to come back. They came, because they remembered, and now they knew how to leave too.